For the majority of my childhood and into my teenage years, my family and I would go on annual camping trips, and for a while we stuck with a very specific campsite that my parents had been going to since before I was born. It was in a really nice area, and we never ran into any other campers while we were there. It was a really great way to get acquainted with nature. However, we ended up going to a different campsite eventually after something indescribable happened that we all agreed was the weirdest and most terrifying thing that's ever happened to us. Our trips would typically last 3 days and 2 nights, and we typically stuck to the same routine every time. We would set up camp, go for a walk, and then on the second day we would go fishing and all of the fun stuff. And on that last day we would just relax until the afternoon and then pack up before going home. It was, all in all, a really great time, and we bonded a lot, and that time was no different. At first, the only difference was that I had just turned 13 and my parents finally decided to let me sleep in my own tent. That first night, I couldn't have been more excited. I brought a little eclectic lantern and some manga to read while I snacked in my tent before bed. And that's exactly what I did. Granted, I might have been up too late because by the time I was getting ready to lie down, I realized that I needed to use the bathroom. I tried to be as quiet as I could as I unzipped my tent and got ready to get out to use the bathroom when I heard my dad call out from their tent, "Hey, bud, you all right?" So let him know what I was doing, and he told me to be careful. I grabbed my lantern and went out into the dark and silent woods, and everything was fine. At first. It wasn't until I had started walking back to my tent that I heard a strange sound coming from the woods behind our tents. It sounded like very slow footsteps moving through the tree line. I figured that it was just a deer, though, since we had seen a lot of them earlier that day. So I just calmly walked back to my tent and zipped it up before going to bed. In the morning, however, I realized that I didn't hear a deer. As I woke up and stepped outside of my tent, my dad told me to watch my step and pointed to the ground. I was stunned when I saw a set of massive paw prints pressed into the soft ground no more than a yard away from my tent, yet must have been walking around while we were sleeping, my dad said as he passed me a thermos with some hot tea in it. We talked about the size of the paw prints for a while, and eventually I asked if he thought that it would come back. My dad reassured me, though, that it was likely just curious about who we were and why we were there. It would most likely leave us all alone, even if it was something dangerous like a wolf. The rest of the day we spent doing activities in the area. But no matter how much I tried to forget about the paw prints, I just couldn't shake them from my mind. And to make things even worse, I was feeling uneasy all day because I kept feeling like something was watching us as we wandered around the woods. It got to the point where I ended up asking my parents if it would be okay for me to stay in their tent that night, which they didn't have a problem with. And I was thankful for it because I had clearly made the right choice. That night, after we all went to bed, I had a hard time getting to sleep because I couldn't help but feel like whatever it was that left those prints would be back that night. And just as I was starting to finally drift off, it was clear that I was right. My eyes sprang open as I heard the sound of soft footprints roaming around on the other side of the tents, and as quietly as I could, I woke my mom and dad up. They both sat up when they finally heard that walking sound that I had been hearing, and by that point I was practically having a panic attack as it sounded like the steps were coming right toward our tent. That was when we all heard the sound of a snarling animal right outside of our tent. We tried to stay as quiet as we could, but that didn't make any difference. The animal continued to snarl as it slowly drew closer to our tent, and eventually we knew that it was right on the other side of the fabric. We all held our breath as time passed that night, and the animal made no sign of leaving our campsite. Over the course of the next couple of hours, we could hear it pacing through the campgrounds, and every now and then it would make its way back to our tent with an eerie snarl. Thankfully, by the time daylight came around, we heard the unmistakable sound of the animal running off into the woods. We waited for a while before my dad finally stepped outside to check the